The dawn mist swallowed the narrow streets of Newark like a grey and damp mantle, clinging to the red bricks of old buildings and to the light posts that flickered in agony. The smell of diesel oil permeated the air, mixing with the comforting aroma of Italian bread that escaped through the cracks of family bakeries that began their work even before the sun thought of rising. In that neighborhood where each corner told a story of struggle and survival, where the cracked sidewalks witnessed generations of immigrants trying to build something better, Stella Romano walked with heavy steps toward the corner market, her worn sneakers scraping against the irregular concrete. At 26 years old, Stella carried in her body much more than extra pounds. She carried the weight of each look of contempt, of each comment murmured behind her back, of each door that closed before she even had a chance to enter. Her ample body moved with an economy of gestures that came from years of trying to occupy the minimum space possible, as if she could become invisible through pure force of will. Her brown hair, always tied in a loose bun, framed a face that could be beautiful if it weren't constantly contracted in an expression of anticipation of the next emotional blow. But it was her eyes that told the true story. Deep brown like wet earth, they held a sadness so ancient it seemed to have been born with her, a melancholy that had settled so deep it was already part of her structure, like bones that never healed properly. The house she was returning to was on a street where the trees had given up growing decades ago. It was a narrow two-story construction with paint peeling in flakes that revealed layers of previous colors, each representing a different era of abandonment. The windows had threadbare curtains that were never completely opened, as if the family living there preferred to keep the world outside. Stella climbed the 3 entrance steps, each one creaking under her weight, with a sound she no longer noticed, as familiar as her own breathing. Inside, the house smelled of mold and old tobacco. The living room was plunged in perpetual gloom, illuminated only by the bluish light of the television that Vincent Romano kept on day and night, invariably tuned to sports betting channels. Vincent was in his usual chair, a synthetic leather recliner that had long lost any pretense of comfort, with his belly swollen from cheap beer overflowing above his loose belt. At 52 years old, he had the face of someone who had given up on everything long ago, with deep creases around his mouth and small eyes that only came alive when there was money at stake or anger to express. Stella passed by him in silence, the shopping bags weighing on her arms. She expected no greeting and received none. Vincent barely lifted his eyes from the screen, where a basketball game unfolded with the intensity he had never dedicated to anything else in life. She headed to the tiny kitchen, where dirty dishes accumulated in the sink in an unstable tower of neglect. The refrigerator, when opened, revealed its almost empty interior, illuminating Stella's face with a pale and sickly light. She began to put away the groceries with mechanical movements, each can of canned food, each package of cheap pasta, finding its designated place on the empty shelves. It was when she was reaching for the top shelf that Vincent's voice cut through the silence like a rusty blade. He didn't need to shout. His voice carried a tone of contempt so natural that the words came out coated with venom even when uttered at normal volume. He commented on how long she had taken, on how much money she had probably wasted, on how her weight continued to increase despite him barely having money to feed her. Each sentence was a poisoned arrow that Stella had learned to let pierce without showing pain. She continued putting away the groceries, her lips pressed in a thin line, her eyes fixed on the shelves as if she found something fascinating enough there to block out the words she knew by heart. Night fell over Newark like a heavy curtain, bringing with it the characteristic sounds of the neighborhood. Cars passed with loud music, voices rose in arguments on the sidewalks, doors slammed, babies cried. Stella went up to her room on the upper floor, a cramped space under the slanted roof where she could barely stand in some spots. The narrow bed occupied most of the space, with faded sheets that she washed every week in an attempt to maintain some dignity amid the general decay of the house. There was a tiny desk against the wall, where she kept her books stacked in unstable columns. They were volumes found in used bookstores, with stained covers and yellowed pages. But for Stella, they were portals to worlds where people like her could be heroines, could be loved, could matter. She sat on the bed, which groaned under her weight, and for a moment allowed her shoulders to drop, allowed the mask of indifference to slip. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, tears she had learned to hold back because crying in front of Vincent only gave him more ammunition. Through the small window, she could see the city lights twinkling in the distance, each one representing a life that was happening without her. People who laughed, loved, lived without carrying the constant weight of their own existence as a condemnation. The sound of raised voices rose through the floorboards. Vincent was on the phone, and even through the thin walls, Stella could feel the tension in his tone. She had heard conversations like this before. They were always about money, about bets that went wrong, about deadlines that weren't met. But this time there was something different, a sharper desperation piercing Vincent's harsh words. She pressed her ear against the wooden floor, a practice she had developed over the years, and managed to catch fragments of the conversation. 300,000. Caruso family. Last chance. The words floated up to her like poisonous leaves carried by the wind. Stella felt her stomach contract. Even she, who lived in the shadows, who avoided conversations in street corners, who kept her eyes down when passing groups of men standing on corners, knew that name. The Caruso family was not a subject discussed openly. It was a presence that hung over the neighborhood like toxic smoke, invisible but omnipresent. They were the invisible owners of half the businesses, the debt collectors that no one dared not to pay, the ghosts that appeared when least expected. The following days brought a change in the atmosphere of the house. Vincent was more nervous, more irritated, drinking earlier and more frequently. His hands trembled when he lit cigarettes, and his small eyes were constantly in motion, like those of a cornered animal looking for an exit that didn't exist. Stella kept even greater distance, moving through the house like a ghost, preparing meals that he barely touched, cleaning spaces that he immediately dirtied. She felt the storm approaching, but didn't know from which direction it would come. It was on a Tuesday night, when the rain began to fall in heavy curtains that transformed the streets into black and shiny rivers, that everything changed. Stella was in the kitchen, washing the dishes from the dinner that Vincent had left half-finished, when she heard the sound of cars stopping in front of the house. They weren't the normal cars of the neighborhood, with noisy engines and broken exhausts. They were smooth, powerful engines, the kind of sound that came from expensive vehicles. Her heart began to beat faster, an instinctive premonition of danger. The knocks on the door were firm, authoritative, the kind of knock that doesn't accept being ignored. Vincent rose from the recliner with heavy movements, staggering from the drink, and went to answer. Stella stood paralyzed by the sink, her hands still submerged in soapy water, listening to the conversation unfolding in the living room. Male voices, low but charged with implicit threat. Vincent's pleading tone, so different from his usual arrogance, revealing the coward who had always hidden behind his cruelty to her. Then she heard her own name. Stella, pronounced by a voice she didn't know, a voice that made each syllable sound like a sentence. Her feet moved before her brain could process, carrying her to the entrance of the living room. There she saw three men who didn't belong to that world of broken furniture and peeling wallpaper. They wore dark suits that seemed to absorb the weak light of the room. Their faces were masks of cold professionalism, and in the center stood a man who was clearly the leader. He wasn't the tallest nor the broadest, but something in him commanded immediate attention. He was around 35 years old, with dark hair combed back with gel, revealing a broad and intelligent forehead. His eyes were black as coal, but they didn't reflect light like coal. They were more like holes, abysses that sucked any warmth around them. He wore a suit that probably cost more than everything in the house combined, and his Italian leather shoes shone even under the weak light. When his eyes landed on Stella, she felt as if she were being dissected, each layer of her being examined and catalogued in a matter of seconds. Vincent was speaking too quickly, his words stumbling over each other in a pathetic attempt to explain, to justify, to plead. The man in the suit raised a hand, a small but absolute gesture, and Vincent immediately silenced like a scolded child. Then the man spoke, and his voice was surprisingly soft, but carried a weight that made the walls seem to close in. He explained the situation with the clinical clarity of a doctor giving a terminal diagnosis. Vincent owed $300,000. Vincent didn't have $300,000. Vincent wouldn't have $300,000 even if he lived 3 lives. Therefore, Vincent needed to offer something of equivalent value. Stella felt the floor disappear under her feet when she understood what was being proposed. No, not proposed, declared, decided. She would be the payment. She would be delivered to the Caruso family as settlement of her father's debt. Vincent didn't protest, didn't argue, didn't show a second of hesitation. His eyes didn't even meet hers. He simply nodded, agreed, accepted, sold his only daughter as if he were getting rid of an old piece of furniture that took up too much space. The man in the suit approached Stella, his steps echoing in the deafening silence that had filled the room. She couldn't move, like a rabbit frozen before the headlights of an approaching car. He stopped a few centimeters from her, so close that she could smell his expensive perfume, something woody and spicy that contrasted violently with the mold and tobacco that permeated the house. He extended his hand, not to touch her, but in a gesture that clearly meant she should follow him. Stella looked at Vincent one last time, searching for something, anything, a glimmer of regret, of guilt, of humanity. But his small eyes were fixed on the television, which continued broadcasting the game as if nothing extraordinary were happening. In that moment, something inside her broke definitively, but also hardened. The last spark of hope that perhaps, somewhere deep and hidden, her father felt something for her, was completely extinguished. And with it also went the paralyzing fear. What worse could happen than what had already happened? She was already dead inside, already a ghost wandering through a life that was never hers. She followed the man out of the house, into the rain that immediately soaked her simple clothes, making them stick to her body in a way that increased her painful awareness of each curve, each fold, each imperfection. The waiting car was black and lustrous, like a dark jewel, completely out of place on that street of rusty and abandoned vehicles. One of the men opened the back door, and Stella entered, sinking into leather seats so soft they seemed to embrace her, a shocking contrast to any surface she had ever touched. The man in the suit entered from the other side, maintaining a respectful distance, but making it clear that escape was impossible. The car began to move, gliding through the soaked streets with a smoothness that made the outside world seem unreal, as if they were moving through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. Stella looked out the window, seeing her neighborhood pass by, the familiar houses, the corners where she had grown up, everything becoming increasingly distant, not just physically but also emotionally. She was leaving behind the only life she had known, however miserable it was. No one spoke during the trip. The silence inside the car was dense, heavy, interrupted only by the soft sound of the engine and the drumming of rain against the roof. Stella kept her hands crossed in her lap, squeezing her fingers so hard that her nails left marks on her skin. She wasn't crying. The tears had dried long ago, or perhaps they were just waiting for a moment of privacy that might never come. The man beside her kept his gaze fixed ahead, his profile sculpted in marble by the intermittent light of passing posts. The car eventually left the tight streets of the periphery and entered areas that Stella only knew from afar. In passing, taller buildings began to appear, their windows lit like yellow eyes in the darkness, stores with carefully arranged window displays, restaurants with menus in golden letters, people walking under elegant umbrellas. It was like crossing into another world, a world where people like her weren't welcome except as invisible service providers. Finally, the car stopped in front of a building that rose against the night sky like a spear of glass and steel. The entrance had thick glass doors guarded by a uniformed doorman who immediately straightened upon seeing the car. The man in the suit got out first and waited for Stella to do the same. She got out with difficulty, her limbs stiff from tension and cold, her soaked clothes weighing twice as much. The doorman showed no surprise or disapproval at seeing her disheveled appearance. His face remained a mask of neutral professionalism as he held the door open. The lobby was a space of silent luxury, with marble flooring that reflected the lights of crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling. There were enormous vases with plants that Stella couldn't name, their green stems too shiny to be real. The man guided her to the elevators, where he inserted a special key before pressing the button for the top floor. The doors closed with a pneumatic whisper, and then they were rising, the elevator so smooth that Stella barely felt the movement. Her reflection stared at her from the mirrored walls of the elevator, and she had to look away. Seeing herself there, soaked, disheveled, obviously out of place in that environment of impeccable elegance, was too painful. The man beside her remained impassive, his eyes fixed on the numbers rising on the digital display. When they reached the top floor, the doors opened directly into a private apartment, eliminating even the need for a hallway. The space that revealed itself before Stella was larger than the entire house where she had spent her life. The floor was polished marble, in shades of grey and white, so shiny it seemed wet. The walls were immaculate white, decorated with abstract paintings whose prices she couldn't even imagine. Minimalist design furniture occupied the open space, each piece seeming to have been chosen not for comfort but for aesthetics. Enormous floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city below, its lights twinkling like fallen stars. It was then that Stella saw the man for real. Not the messenger who had picked her up, but the man she now belonged to. Dominic Caruso stood by the windows, his back to her, his hands in the pockets of perfectly cut dress pants. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing muscular forearms covered in tattoos that contrasted with the elegance of his clothes. At 38 years old, Dominic had the physique of someone who maintained absolute control over his body, just as he maintained over everything else in his life. His shoulders were broad, his posture erect, each muscle defined under the Egyptian cotton shirt. He turned slowly, and Stella finally saw the face of the man who now owned her. It was a face that could have been handsome, if it weren't sculpted by years of violence and absolute power. His jaw was square and strong, covered by 3-day stubble maintained with millimetric precision. His nose had been broken at least once and never properly fixed, giving him a slightly crooked air that paradoxically increased his presence. But it was his eyes that dominated his face. Grey like steel, cold like ice, they seemed to see through people, dissecting lies, measuring weaknesses, calculating values. Those eyes now examined Stella with an intensity that made her want to shrink, disappear, turn to smoke. She forced herself to remain still, to keep her chin up, even when every fibre of her being screamed to hide. Dominic walked toward her with measured steps, each movement economical and deliberate, like a predator who doesn't need to hurry because his prey has nowhere to run. He stopped a few steps from her, his height making her have to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. For a long moment no one said anything. Dominic simply looked, and Stella forced herself not to look away, even though her heart was beating so hard she was sure everyone in the apartment could hear it. Then finally, Dominic spoke. His voice was deep, controlled, each word uttered with the precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. He instructed the man who had brought her to get dry clothes and something hot to eat. Stella blinked, surprised. It wasn't what she expected. She didn't know exactly what she expected, but it certainly wasn't concern for her physical comfort. The man in the suit nodded and disappeared through a door that Stella hadn't noticed, leaving her alone with Dominic. The silence returned, heavier now without the presence of the third person. Dominic continued looking at her, and Stella felt as if she were being evaluated, weighed on an invisible scale, judged by criteria she didn't understand. Finally, Dominic gestured toward the huge grey leather sofa that dominated the living room. It wasn't a gentle invitation, but it also wasn't a harsh order. It was simply an instruction. Stella walked to the sofa with legs that seemed to have forgotten how to work properly, each step echoing in the vast space. She sat on the edge, not daring to relax against the backrest, her hands crossed in her lap in a posture she had learned to associate with minimum safety. Dominic didn't sit. Instead, he walked to an elegant bar in the corner of the room and poured something from a crystal bottle that probably cost more than Vincent's car. He drank slowly, his profile highlighted against the enormous windows, the city lights creating a strange halo around his silhouette. Stella waited because she didn't know what else to do. Waiting was something she had learned well over the years. The man in the suit returned, carrying a pile of fluffy towels and a white robe that seemed made of clouds. He placed them beside Stella without making eye contact, and then withdrew again. Dominic turned and watched as she simply looked at the towels, without moving. He then spoke, his voice breaking the silence like a stone breaking glass. He told her to dry off and change clothes. The bathroom was there. He indicated a door to the left. Stella took the towels with trembling hands and walked to the bathroom, each step seeming to take her deeper into a surreal dream. The bathroom was larger than her entire room at home. It had a marble bathtub embedded in the floor, showers with multiple jets, a mirror that covered an entire wall. Everything was white and chrome, immaculate, cold. She locked the door behind her and finally allowed her knees to give way. She slid to the cold floor, hugging the towels against her chest, and only then did the tears come. They weren't dramatic sobs or cries of despair. They were silent tears that ran down her face like rain on glass, wetting the soft towels she held. She cried for the life she never had, for the father who never loved her, for the person she could have been if circumstances were different. She cried for the girl who once dreamed of beautiful things, of love, of being seen, before the world taught her that dreams were for people who mattered. And then, when the tears dried, she stood up. Stella removed her soaked clothes, letting them fall to the floor in a wet pile. She avoided looking in the mirror, an old practice, but allowed herself to use one of the towels to dry off. The fabric was softer than anything that had ever touched her skin, absorbing the moisture with gentle efficiency. She put on the robe, which was big even for her, wrapping her body in white layers that smelled of lavender, and something more, something expensive that she couldn't identify. For a moment, standing there in that luxurious bathroom, she almost managed to pretend she was a different person, someone who belonged to that world of marble and light. When she came out, she found a bowl of steaming soup waiting on the coffee table, along with fresh bread and a bottle of water. Dominic was sitting in an armchair on the other side of the room, a laptop open on his lap, his fingers typing with the same controlled precision with which he did everything else. He didn't look up when she approached, didn't comment on her appearance, simply continued working as if she weren't there. Stella sat down again on the sofa and looked at the food. Her stomach, which she had learned to ignore over the years, growled treacherously. The soup smelled of something homemade, of tomatoes and basil and garlic, smells that awakened memories of an earlier time, of when her mother was still alive and the kitchen was a place of warmth instead of obligation. She picked up the spoon, with fingers that still trembled slightly, and tasted. The flavor exploded in her mouth, rich and complex, so different from the canned soups and frozen foods that made up her usual diet. She ate slowly, each spoonful a small revelation. Dominic continued working, the sound of his keys creating a constant rhythm in the silence. When she finished, Stella simply held the empty bowl, not knowing what to do with it. Finally, Dominic closed the laptop and looked directly at her. His grey eyes studied her face for a moment that seemed to stretch eternally, and then he spoke. He said she would sleep in the guest room, that her only rule was not to try to leave the apartment, that in the morning they would talk about what would come next. His voice was neutral, factual, without explicit threat, but also without false kindness. He stood up and gestured for her to follow him, leading her through the apartment to a room that was larger and better decorated than any place where she had ever slept. The bed was enormous, covered with white sheets that looked like silk. There was an empty closet, an antique dresser of dark wood, an armchair by the window where someone could sit and look at the city. Dominic pointed out the private bathroom, informed her that there were hygiene products in all the cabinets, and then simply left, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Stella stood in the middle of the room for a long time, trying to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. Her entire life had changed with the speed of a car accident, and she was still trying to understand the impact. She walked to the window and looked out at the city that stretched like a carpet of lights to the horizon. Down there, somewhere, was the house where she had grown up, the chair where Vincent was probably still sitting, the life she had left behind. But in that moment, so high above everything, she didn't feel homesick. She felt only a deep numbness, as if her body and mind had finally reached their maximum capacity to process pain and simply shut down. She eventually lay down on the bed, still wearing the robe because she had nothing else. The mattress was so soft she almost sank, so different from the old and uneven bed she had known all her life. The city lights entered through the windows, creating shadow patterns on the ceiling that she observed until her eyes finally closed. Morning arrived with grey light filtering through the low clouds. Stella woke up disoriented, taking several seconds to remember where she was. The apartment was silent, so silent that she could hear her own breathing. She got up and found clothes folded on a chair that hadn't been there the night before. They were simple clothes, sweatpants, and a long-sleeved t-shirt, both in her size. Someone had entered the room while she slept, and the thought made her shudder. She dressed quickly and left the room, her bare feet making no sound on the cold marble. The apartment seemed different in daylight, less intimidating but no less strange. She followed the smell of coffee and found the kitchen, an enormous space of stainless steel and black granite, where Dominic was sitting at the table with a newspaper open in front of him and a cup of steaming coffee in his hand. He looked up when she entered, his eyes making a quick assessment before returning to the newspaper. He indicated with a gesture the coffee maker, a complex Italian machine that Stella had no idea how to operate. She stood looking at it for a moment, her ignorance obvious, until Dominic sighed softly, stood up and prepared a cup for her. He placed it on the table and returned to his chair. This entire process performed with an economy of movement that suggested controlled impatience. Stella sat down, took the cup with both hands to keep them from trembling, and drank. The coffee was strong and bitter, without sugar or milk, but she didn't ask for any. They remained like this for several minutes, the silence punctuated only by the sound of pages turning and coffee being drunk. Finally, Dominic folded the newspaper and rested his elbows on the table, his hands interlaced in front of him. He looked directly at her, and this time his gaze wasn't just evaluative. There was something more there, a curiosity perhaps, or confusion. He asked her full name. Stella answered, with a voice she hadn't used in hours, hoarse and low. Stella Marie Romano. He repeated it, as if testing the sound in his own voice. Then he asked her age, her education, what she did before. The questions came at a steady pace, each one formulated with clinical precision. Stella answered honestly because she saw no reason to lie. 26 years old. High school graduate. She worked in a laundromat until it closed 6 months ago. Since then, nothing. Dominic listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving her face, as if he were reading something in the subtext of her answers. When she finished, he was silent for a moment, processing. Then, for the first time, something like an expression crossed his face. It wasn't sympathy, not exactly, but perhaps recognition, as if he saw in her something familiar, an echo of something he knew. He explained the situation with the same clinical frankness he had used to question. Her father owed an impossible amount. Her father had offered her as payment. Dominic had accepted because refusing would have meant worse consequences for Vincent, consequences that eventually would have splashed onto her anyway. She was here now. She would stay here. It wasn't negotiable, but he also made it clear that he had no interest in hurting her, in humiliating her, or in using her in the way she probably feared. Stella listened to all this with an impassive expression, years of practice hiding her reactions. But something in the way Dominic spoke, in the absence of gratuitous cruelty in his words, planted a small seed of something she couldn't identify. It wasn't hope. She had learned not to trust that treacherous emotion. It was more like cautious curiosity, a desire to understand the man who now controlled her destiny. The days began to acquire a strange routine. Stella woke up with the sun already high. Because Dominic didn't impose schedules, she explored the apartment carefully, discovering rooms she hadn't noticed the first night. There was a library with entire walls of leather-bound books, a complete gym with equipment she didn't know how to use, an office with computers and multiple screens that always showed graphs and numbers she didn't understand. Dominic was frequently absent during the day, leaving early and returning late, always wearing perfectly cut suits, always with that air of absolute control. But when he was home, he established an unexpected pattern. They dined together. They weren't social meals. There was no small talk or attempts to create intimacy, but he insisted that she sit at the table with him, that she eat from the same food prepared by a chef who appeared and disappeared like a silent ghost. It was during these silent dinners that Stella began to observe. She noticed how Dominic ate with methodical precision, cutting each piece of meat to the exact size before putting it in his mouth. She noticed the small scar above his left eyebrow, almost invisible but there nonetheless. She noticed how his eyes, so cold and controlled during the day, sometimes seemed tired at night, as if carrying the weight of his empire demanded a price he rarely let show. And Dominic also observed. Stella felt his gaze on her when he thought she didn't notice, studying the way she held the silverware, how she tasted the food with small hesitations, as if each bite could be a trap. One night, he asked why she read so much. The question surprised her because she didn't think he had noticed the books she borrowed from his library. She answered honestly, without thinking. She said that books were places where she could be anyone, where her body didn't matter, where she was defined by more than her appearance. Something changed in Dominic's face when she said that. It was subtle, just a slight tightening around his eyes, but it was there. He nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he suspected. The dinner continued in silence, but it was a different silence now, less hostile, more contemplative. When they finished, instead of simply leaving the table as he usually did, Dominic asked what book she was reading. That's how the conversations began. Small at first, just a few sentences exchanged about literature, about stories, about characters they both knew. Stella discovered that Dominic had read more than she would expect from a man in his position. He knew the classics, could quote Shakespeare from memory, had strong opinions about Dostoevsky. Their discussions were intense because Dominic didn't do anything halfway, not even casual conversations. Stella began to see beyond the facade of power and control. She saw a man who clearly didn't sleep enough, who sometimes stood by the windows at 3 a.m, just looking at the city with an expression she could only describe as deep loneliness. She saw how he never received personal visits, how his phone rang constantly, but he rarely smiled during those conversations, how he had everything money could buy but lived in his palace of glass and marble, like a self-imposed prisoner. One night, almost 3 weeks after her arrival, Stella was in the library when Dominic entered. He looked more tired than usual, his tie loosened, the first 2 buttons of his shirt open. She was curled up in an enormous leather armchair, a thick book open in her lap, the weak light from a lamp creating a golden circle around her. He stopped in the doorway, observing her for a moment, and then, to her surprise, sat in the armchair beside her. They stayed like that for a while, she reading, He simply sitting, his head resting against the backrest, his eyes closed. Eventually, without opening his eyes, he began to speak. They weren't dramatic confessions or emotional revelations. It was more like thinking aloud, words coming out in a slow and steady stream. He spoke about growing up on the streets of Newark, about a father who disappeared before he had memories, and a mother who worked herself to death trying to keep him fed. He spoke about the choices he had to make, about how power was something he took because it was that, or be crushed. Stella listened without interrupting, her book forgotten, completely focused on this version of Dominic she had never seen before. When he finished, a dense silence filled the library. Then, for the first time since they met, Stella voluntarily shared something of herself. She spoke about her mother, who died when she was 12 years old, taking with her the only source of love Stella had known. She spoke about how Vincent changed after that, how his disappointment with life transformed into cruelty, directed at the only person who couldn't fight back. Dominic opened his eyes and turned his head to look at her. In that soft library light, his eyes seemed less steel and more mist, less cold and more just tired. He didn't offer empty platitudes or false sympathy. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement that they both carried wounds the world didn't see. Something changed between them that night. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was real. In the days that followed, the walls they both maintained began to develop small cracks. Dominic began to explain where he was going, what he was doing, not because he owed her explanations, but because he wanted her to understand. Stella began to move through the apartment with less caution, allowing herself to touch things, to sit comfortably, to occupy space. She discovered that Dominic had a dry and unexpected sense of humor, which emerged in quick comments that made her smile before she could stop herself. He discovered that she had a sharp intelligence that had never had the opportunity to develop, that she saw patterns and connections that others missed. He began to ask her opinion about things, first as a test, perhaps, but then genuinely interested in her perspective. One afternoon, Dominic arrived home earlier than usual and found Stella in the kitchen, trying to figure out how to use the professional stove. She was making a mess, frustrated with the complicated technology, and he laughed. It was the first time she heard him laugh for real, not the dry and humorless sound he sometimes made, but a real laugh that transformed his entire face. He gently moved her aside and showed her how it worked, his movements efficient and practical, clearly familiar with that kitchen despite never using it. They cooked together, and it was surprisingly natural. Dominic moved through the kitchen with the same precision he applied to everything, but there was something relaxed in his movements, as if that space were a sanctuary where he could let his guard down. Stella tried to keep up, and when she made mistakes, he corrected her without impatience, his hands occasionally touching hers to guide a knife or adjust the temperature. The dinner they created together wasn't perfect, but it tasted of something more than food. It tasted of cooperation, of shared effort, of two lonely people discovering that perhaps they didn't need to be so alone. While they ate, Dominic told stories from his childhood, small anecdotes that revealed layers of complexity that Stella was just beginning to understand. She responded with her own stories, carefully edited at first, but becoming more honest as she saw that he really listened. The weeks turned into months, and the dynamic between them continued evolving. Dominic began to include her in parts of his life that were clearly private. He took her to the terrace, on top of the building, on a clear night, where they could see the entire city spread below them like a living map. He showed her his favorite car, a restored classic that he kept in a private garage and that he drove only when he needed to think. He spoke about his work, about the complexities of managing an empire built on morally grey territory, about the impossible decisions he had to make. Stella began to understand that Dominic wasn't the monster that reputation suggested, but he also wasn't innocent. He did terrible things when necessary, made decisions that stained his hands and soul, but he did it with full awareness of the weight, never allowing himself the convenience of pretending that his acts had no consequences. There was a brutal honesty in his self-awareness that Stella found strangely refreshing compared to the hypocrisy she had seen in people who considered themselves good but treated others with casual cruelty. And Stella also shared more. She spoke about the years of bullying at school, about how she learned to become invisible because being noticed meant being a target, about how she developed love for words because they were the only thing no one could take from her, about the small and modest dreams she had once had, before learning that dreams weren't for people like her. Dominic listened to everything with intense attention, his eyes never straying, and she knew he really absorbed every word. One night, almost 4 months after her arrival, Stella was preparing for bed when she heard a noise coming from the living room. It was late, past midnight, and Dominic should have been sleeping. She left her room and found him sitting in the dark, only the city light illuminating his profile. There was a bottle of whiskey beside him, half empty, and his face carried an expression she couldn't interpret. She approached silently and sat on the other side of the sofa, maintaining respectful distance. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Dominic began to speak, his voice slightly slurred by alcohol, but his words chosen carefully. He spoke about a man he had to kill years ago, not out of anger or greed, but because it was necessary to protect something bigger. He spoke about how that man had family, children, and how Dominic ensured they were cared for anonymously, a penance that didn't change anything, but that he couldn't help doing. He confessed that sometimes he woke up with the weight of all the lives he had affected, all the decisions he had made, all the lines he had crossed. He said he had built an empire, but lived in a prison, surrounded by luxury, but suffocating in loneliness. And then, for the first time, he looked directly at her and said something that made Stella's heart stop. He said that since she had arrived, for the first time in years, the apartment didn't seem so empty. That talking to her was the only thing he looked forward to in his days. That she saw him in a way no one else did, without paralyzing fear, but also without simplistic judgment. Stella didn't know what to answer. The words stuck in her throat were dangerous, full of implications she wasn't ready to confront. So instead of speaking, she simply extended her hand and touched his, where it rested on the sofa. It was the first voluntary touch between them, her fingers just grazing his knuckles, but the impact was electric. Dominic looked at their joined hands, his eyes widening slightly, as if he too felt the magnitude of that small gesture. They stayed like that until the bottle was empty and the city began to lighten with dawn. And when they finally separated to go to sleep, something fundamental had changed. They were no longer captor and hostage, no longer strangers sharing space. They were two damaged people who somehow found in each other a mirror where they could see themselves reflected without distortion. The following days were filled with heightened awareness of each other. Stella noticed how Dominic sometimes paused when passing by her, as if he wanted to say something but changed his mind. How his eyes followed her when she moved through the room, not with the initial clinical assessment, but with something softer, almost reverent. How he had begun to smile more, small smiles that transformed his marble face into something almost young. Dominic noticed how Stella allowed herself to laugh now, a sound she clearly hadn't practiced in years, but that was beginning to emerge more frequently. How she had begun to wear the clothes he had made for her, simple pieces but well cut that showed she was beginning to see herself as someone who deserved beautiful things. How she waited for him when he came home, not because she had to wait, but because she wanted to. It was Marco, Dominic's right-hand man, who brought the storm back to their lives. He appeared on a Sunday afternoon when Stella was reading on the terrace and Dominic was working in his office. She heard raised voices, something rare in the apartment, and felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. When she returned inside, she found Dominic and Marco in a tense discussion, their voices low but charged with contained anger. Marco was arguing about a territorial war with a rival family, the Bertelli, who were invading operations in Newark. He wanted to respond with force, make an example, show weakness would invite more attacks. Dominic argued for strategic restraint, for finding solutions that didn't escalate to unnecessary violence. The discussion went in circles until Marco played his final card. He said that Dominic was distracted, that his priorities had changed since that woman appeared. The silence that followed was absolute. Stella felt the blood drain from her face, knowing that Marco had just placed her at the center of something dangerous. Dominic became completely still, his body a tense line of restraint. When he spoke, his voice was so cold that Stella felt chills. He told Marco to choose his next words very carefully, because depending on what came out of his mouth, their long friendship could end in that moment. Marco hesitated, clearly realizing he had crossed a line. He looked from Dominic to Stella and back, recalculating. Then he softened his tone, apologized, said he was just concerned about business. Dominic dismissed him with a curt gesture, and Marco left, but not before casting one last look at Stella that made something uncomfortable curl in her stomach. When they were alone, Dominic didn't look at her immediately. He stood by the windows, his hands closed in fists at his sides, his breathing controlled, but clearly costing effort. Stella approached cautiously, stopping a few steps from him. She said his name softly, and he finally turned, his eyes revealing a storm of emotions he rarely let show. He asked if she was afraid of him. The question surprised her because it was obvious it was something that bothered him. Stella thought carefully before responding, weighing her words. She said she had been afraid in the beginning, but not anymore, that she had seen him angry, under pressure, in moments of tension, and never once had he directed that intensity against her. That fear was something Vincent had taught her, but Dominic had shown her something different. Dominic closed the distance between them in 2 steps, and suddenly he was so close that Stella could feel the heat radiating from him. He raised his hand, hesitant, and touched her face with a gentleness that contrasted violently with everything she knew about him. His fingers traced the line of her jaw, his eyes following the movement as if he were memorizing every detail. Then he spoke, his voice hoarse with unspoken emotion. He said she made him want to be better than he was, that her presence in the apartment had become the only good constant in his life. That he didn't know when it happened, but somewhere between the conversations about books and the silent dinners and the stolen moments of mutual understanding, she had become essential. That the idea of something happening to her, of her being used against him, made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't experienced since childhood. Stella couldn't respond because her throat was too tight, but she didn't need to respond because her eyes said everything. She covered his hand with hers where it rested against her face, keeping it there, making his touch remain. And in that moment, in the charged silence of the apartment, both recognized what had been growing between them, what neither of them had dared to name until now. But the world Dominic inhabited didn't forgive weaknesses, and love was the most dangerous weakness of all. The Bertelli made their move 3 days later. It was a Thursday night, and Dominic had a meeting at the docks, a delicate negotiation about distribution routes that he preferred to handle personally. Stella stayed in the apartment, restless for reasons she couldn't articulate. Something in the air seemed wrong, a tension that made her nerves sing with apprehension. She was in the library when her phone rang. Dominic had insisted she have one, programmed with just a few essential numbers, mainly his. Seeing his name on the screen made her answer immediately, but it wasn't his voice on the other side. It was Marco, and his urgent tone made Stella's blood freeze. He told her to stay where she was, lock all the doors, not let anyone in. He said the situation at the docks had escalated, that the Bertelli had brought more men than expected, that Dominic was fine for now, but needed the distraction eliminated. Stella wasn't stupid. She knew what Marco was really saying. She was the distraction. She was the weakness that Dominic's enemies could exploit. And suddenly, with crystal clarity, she understood that her presence in Dominic's world put him in danger in ways he might not admit to himself. But before she could fully process that thought, The elevator pinged. Someone was coming up, and they had the special key needed to reach the apartment. Stella ran to the door, checked the security monitor that Dominic had shown her once, and felt her heart drop. There were 3 men she didn't recognize, dressed too casually, moving with the kind of purpose that came before violence. She ran to Dominic's room, remembering that he kept a gun in the safe in the nightstand. He had shown her once, insisting she know where it was, in case of emergency. Her hands trembled as she typed the code he had made her memorize, and when the safe opened, there it was, heavy and cold and terrifying. She had never held a gun before, but she had no choice now. The knocking on the door began, firm and insistent. A voice called out, pretending to deliver something, trying to make her open. Stella stood frozen in the room, the gun weighing in her sweaty hands, her heart beating so loud she could barely think. Then the knocking stopped, and for a moment she thought maybe they had left, until she heard the sound of tools against the lock, the metallic click of someone breaking into the entrance. Stella backed into the closet, crouching behind Dominic's expensive suits, the gun pointed at the door with hands that trembled violently. She could hear the men entering the apartment, their voices low as they searched. One of them laughed, a cruel sound that made her skin crawl. They said she would make everything easier if she simply came out, that they didn't want to hurt her, just use her to send a message. Footsteps approached the room. The door opened slowly, light from the hallway cutting through the darkness. Stella held her breath, every muscle tense, waiting. And then a figure appeared, silhouetted against the light, beginning to enter the room. His hand reached for the light switch, and in the instant before turning it on, Stella did something she never imagined being capable of doing. But before she could pull the trigger, the sound of gunshots exploded from another place in the apartment. Screams followed, then heavy silence. The man in the room turned and ran back to the hallway. More shots, more screams, then only silence. Stella remained frozen in the closet, barely breathing, waiting to see if she would live or die. Then a familiar voice cut through the silence, urgent and harsh. Dominic shouted her name, and the relief that flooded Stella was so intense her knees almost gave way. She came out of the closet, still holding the gun, and found Dominic standing in the doorway of the room. His suit was stained with blood. His face had a cut above his eye, but he was alive, was whole. His eyes swept the room until they found her, and the expression on his face was something she had never seen before. It was pure terror, not for himself, but for her. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her against his chest with enough force to hurt, as if he were verifying that she was real, that she was okay. His hand pressed the back of her head, keeping her against him, and she could feel his heart hammering against her ear. They stayed like that for long moments, neither of them speaking, just holding each other as the adrenaline slowly drained. Eventually, Dominic pulled her away enough to look at her face, his hands framing her cheeks, his thumbs wiping away tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. He said he was sorry, that he should never have left her so exposed, that this should never have happened, but Stella shook her head because she understood now. She understood that Dominic's world was violent and unpredictable, that her mere existence in his life put her in the crosshairs of people who would see her only as a tool or weakness. She understood that no matter how much they were developing something real, something deep, perhaps it wasn't enough against the brutal reality that surrounded them. Marco appeared in the doorway, his face somber, informing that the Bertelli had been more ambitious than they thought, that they had tried to hit Dominic in 2 places at the same time, that thanks to a last-minute informant, they managed to arrive in time here, but that the message was clear. The Bertelli wanted war, and now they would get it. Dominic nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes hardening back to the mask of control that Stella had known in the beginning. But when he looked back at her, for a brief moment the mask slipped, and she saw the man behind, the man who was divided between what his life demanded and what his heart wanted. Marco waited for instructions, but Dominic simply said to deal with the bodies, to clean everything, to increase security. Then he dismissed Marco and guided Stella back through the apartment, deliberately not looking at the red stains on the white marble that would eventually be cleaned as if they had never existed. He led her to the library, the space that had become their sanctuary, and sat her in the armchair where she had spent so many nights reading. He knelt in front of her, a position so contrary to his nature that it demonstrated the seriousness of the moment. He took her hands in his and held them firmly, his grey eyes penetrating hers with fierce intensity. He said she had a choice. She could stay, knowing that nights like this could happen again, that being with him meant being in constant danger, or he would help her start over somewhere far away, in another state or even country, with enough resources to never have to worry about money. Free from Vincent, free from him, free from everything. He said the decision was completely hers, and that whatever she chose, he would respect it. Stella looked at the man kneeling before her, this impossible man, who controlled a criminal empire with an iron fist, but who treated her with kindness that bordered on reverence. This man who had killed people, but who also ensured their families were cared for. This man who inspired fear in dozens, but who looked at her as if she were something precious and fragile. And she thought about what her life was like before him, existing but not living, moving through days without color or meaning. And then she thought about the last few weeks, about the conversations that made hours disappear, about the comfortable silences that didn't need to be filled, about the way he made her feel as if she mattered, as if she were seen, as if she were desired not despite her appearance, but simply as a complete person. She thought about how she woke up hoping to see him, how days without him seemed grayer, how his rare laughter had become the sound she valued most. The answer came not from fear or despair, but from something deeper. It came from the recognition that for the first time in her life she had something worth fighting to preserve, that the danger that came with Dominic was real, but life without him would just be returning to the slow death she already knew. She squeezed his hands back and said she would stay. She said she understood the risks, that she wasn't naive about the world he inhabited, but that for the first time she felt she belonged somewhere, that she had purpose beyond simply surviving, that he made her feel alive in ways she couldn't fully articulate, but that she wasn't ready to give that up. Dominic closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, there was moisture there that he didn't try to hide. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers, breathing her air, sharing her space in a way that was more intimate than any physical touch they had yet shared. And there, in that suspended moment, both recognized they had crossed a line from which there was no return. The war with the Bertelli escalated in the following weeks. Dominic was more frequently absent, and when he was home, he carried the weight of difficult decisions in his tense shoulders and lines around his eyes. But he always made time for her, always dined with her when he could, always sought her out in the small moments stolen between storms of violence and strategy. Stella began to understand the layers of how his world worked. Marco came with updates, and she began to sit in on meetings, silent but present. At first, Dominic's men looked at her with confusion and some disrespect, but Dominic made it clear she had his endorsement, and that was enough. She discovered she had a talent for seeing patterns, for identifying inconsistencies in stories, for noticing when something didn't make sense. Her observations, when she dared to share them, often proved valuable. Marco, however, continued to be a problem. He wasn't openly hostile, but Stella felt his disapproval, saw how he looked at her when he thought she didn't notice. Dominic also noticed, and the tension between the two men grew. Marco argued that Dominic had changed, that his decisions were more cautious, that he was prioritizing safety over necessary aggression. It was during one of these tense discussions that everything exploded. Marco was pushing for a preemptive strike against a Bertelli warehouse, something Dominic saw as unnecessarily risky. The discussion escalated until Marco, frustrated, said something that crossed all lines. He said the fat girl was making Dominic lose focus, that he was thinking with the wrong part of his anatomy, that if he couldn't do what needed to be done, maybe it was time for someone stronger to take over. The silence that followed was absolute. Stella, who was sitting in the corner of the office, felt the air leave the room. Dominic became so still, he seemed carved from stone, his eyes fixed on Marco with an intensity that would make weaker men run. When he spoke, his voice was so cold it made the air seem warm in comparison. He said Marco had 2 seconds to leave the office before Dominic did something they would both regret. That their long history together was the only reason Marco was still breathing. That if he ever spoke about Stella that way again, friendship wouldn't be enough to save him. Marco hesitated, clearly divided between pride and self-preservation instinct, then turned and left, slamming the door behind him with enough force to make the pictures tremble on the walls. Dominic remained motionless for a long moment, his breathing controlled but heavy. Then he turned to Stella, and the expression on his face was too complex to interpret. There was anger, but also something like guilt, as if he felt responsible for exposing her to that cruelty. He began to apologize, but Stella interrupted him. She said Marco's words didn't hurt her because she had heard worse all her life, that she understood he was frustrated and looking for someone to blame. But she also said she wasn't blind to the tensions her presence created, to the ways she complicated Dominic's life. She asked if perhaps Marco was right, if she was being selfish by staying when it clearly caused problems. Dominic crossed the office in quick steps and grabbed her arms, not with force but with urgency, making her look at him. He said Marco was wrong, that any change in Dominic wasn't weakness, but something closer to humanity, that for the first time in years, he cared about something beyond power and survival, that she wasn't a distraction or weakness. She was the only thing keeping him anchored when everything else threatened to drag him into complete darkness. His voice broke slightly on the last words, and Stella saw behind all the defenses, saw the man who was so tired of being strong, so tired of being alone, so tired of carrying everything without anyone to share the weight. She raised her hands and framed his face, forcing him to really see her, and said something she hadn't planned to say, but that was too true to contain. She said she loved him, not despite who he was, not ignoring the dark parts, but seeing everything, knowing everything, and loving anyway. That he had made her feel alive for the first time, that he had treated her as human when the entire world had treated her as invisible, that she understood their love was complicated and dangerous and perhaps doomed, but it was real, it was hers, and she wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. Dominic stood motionless, his eyes wide with something like shock. No one had ever said those words to him, not for real, not without wanting something in return. And here was this woman, this impossible woman who should have been just a transaction, but who had become everything, saying the words he never thought he deserved to hear. He pulled her against him with a desperation that revealed years of loneliness, his face buried in her hair, his arms around her as if she were the only thing keeping him whole. And then, against her hair, he whispered the words back. He said he loved her, that she had changed everything, that he didn't know how he had lived so long without her, when now it seemed impossible to breathe when she wasn't around. They stayed like that for an eternal time, holding each other in the middle of the chaos that was Dominic's life, finding in each other something like peace. When they finally separated, Stella saw tears in Dominic's eyes, the first time she saw him cry, and knew they were real, that they came from a place he rarely accessed. But the world didn't stop because they found love, and the storm was still growing. Marco didn't return to the apartment, but his absence was more threatening than his presence. Dominic received reports that Marco was having private conversations with other members of the organization, that he was planting seeds of doubt about Dominic's leadership. It was a betrayal that hurt not just tactically, but personally, because Marco and Dominic had history, had built everything together from the beginning. Stella saw the weight of this in Dominic, saw how he looked at his phone when Marco didn't respond to messages, how he stood by the windows for hours, clearly struggling with what he needed to do. One night, she asked directly what he was going to do about Marco. Dominic hesitated, then admitted he didn't know, that the obvious solution, the solution any leader in his position would take, was to eliminate the threat. But Marco was more than an employee. He was a brother in everything except blood. Stella then understood the true cost of Dominic's world. It wasn't just the sleepless nights or the constant danger. It was having to make impossible choices. It was living in a world where loyalty could turn in seconds, where love and friendship were dangerous luxuries, where normal human weakness was an invitation to destruction. It was 2 days later that Marco's trap revealed itself. Dominic received a call for an urgent meeting at the docks, supposedly with a Bertelli lieutenant wanting to negotiate. The details seemed legitimate, verified through usual channels, but Stella felt something wrong. She couldn't explain it. It was just instinct, the same instinct that had kept her alive through years under Vincent's cruelty. She begged Dominic not to go, or at least to take more men than usual. Dominic paused upon hearing her concern. At another time, he would have ignored it, trusting his own assessment. But he had learned to trust her instincts, learned that she saw things others missed. So he did something that surprised them both. He decided to send others in his place to check first, to confirm the meeting was legitimate. It was the decision that saved his life, because when his men arrived at the docks, they found not negotiators, but an ambush. Marco was there, with half of Dominic's men that he had turned, plus Bertelli reinforcements. It was a coup, carefully planned, meant to eliminate Dominic and take control. But with Dominic absent, the plan crumbled. There was gunfire, confusion, then flight when it became clear they had been deceived. The news reached the apartment like a bomb. Dominic stood absolutely still upon hearing it, processing the magnitude of the betrayal. Marco wasn't just questioning his leadership. He was actively trying to kill him, was allied with his enemies, was willing to destroy everything they had built together. And he had almost succeeded. Dominic looked at Stella with an expression she would never forget. It was gratitude and love and something deeper, recognition that she had literally saved his life simply by asking him to be careful. He crossed the room and held her as if she were a lifeline in a stormy ocean, and Stella knew something fundamental had changed. She was no longer just a person he loved. She was a partner in the truest sense, someone whose voice he valued, whose instincts he trusted. But now came the consequences. Marco had forced Dominic's hand, eliminated any possibility of reconciliation. Dominic would have to respond, and respond with force, or he would appear weak, inviting more betrayals. It was the brutal reality of the world he inhabited, where hesitation was death and mercy was a luxury few could afford. In the hours that followed, the apartment transformed into a command center. Loyal men came and went, reports were compiled, plans were formed. Stella stood by Dominic's side through everything, her presence silent but constant, reminding him of why it was worth fighting, of what he was protecting. When they were finally alone in the early morning, Dominic was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical. He admitted he would have to kill Marco. There was no other option now. Marco knew too much, had betrayed too much, had threatened too much. But the weight of that necessity was clearly crushing Dominic, because Marco represented a past he valued, a memory of a time when his motivations were simpler, his alliances clearer. Stella held his hands and said something she knew was risky but necessary. She said she couldn't make that choice for him, that she wouldn't pretend to fully understand the complexities of his world. But she said that whatever decision he made, she would be by his side, that she wouldn't judge him for the impossible choices his life required, that she loved him not despite the darkness he carried, but knowing it completely, accepting that part of the man she loved was formed by terrible things, necessary to survive in a terrible world. The implicit permission in those words, the acceptance without judgment, seemed to release something in Dominic. He pulled her into his lap, a position she would normally avoid out of self-consciousness about her weight, but he held her firmly, as if she weighed nothing, as if he wanted her as close as possible. They stayed like that for a long hour, not talking, just existing together, finding strength in each other's presence. The final confrontation with Marco came faster than expected. Marco, realizing his plan had failed and that Dominic now knew of his betrayal, made a desperate move. He appeared at the building with a small group of loyalists, demanding a meeting, threatening to go public with secrets that could destroy Dominic's empire if he wasn't heard. Dominic agreed to meet him on the terrace, neutral space, just the two of them. But he insisted Marco come unarmed, that this would be a final conversation between them. Marco agreed, probably thinking he could still manipulate Dominic, exploit their shared history, find a way back. Stella begged to go along, to be there, but Dominic was firm. He said this was something he needed to do alone, that he didn't want her involved if things got violent. But he promised to return, promised he would be careful, and she had to trust that. She waited in the apartment, each minute dragging like an eternity. She could hear voices from the terrace, sometimes raised, sometimes calmer, but couldn't distinguish words. Then, silence. Silence so long she began to panic, imagining the worst scenarios. When Dominic finally returned, he was alone. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly, but he was unharmed. She ran to him, checking if he was okay, and he simply held her, breathing heavily as if he had run a marathon. Eventually he said it was finished. Marco was dead. Not by Dominic's men, but by Dominic's own hand. A choice he made because Marco deserved at least that, to die by the hands of a brother instead of strangers. Stella didn't ask for details. She simply guided Dominic to the bathroom, turned on the shower, and helped him remove his stained clothes. She cared for him the way he had always cared for her, with kindness that didn't demand explanations or judgments. She sat with him while he showered in silence, processing what he had done, the weight of having killed someone he once loved as a brother. Later, in the darkness of his room, Dominic finally cried. They weren't just tears for Marco, but for everything he had lost over the years, all the humanity he had to bury to survive, all the lines he had crossed, all the weights he carried. Stella held him through it all, her own tears mixing with his, both mourning the tragedy of lives lived on the margins, where love was a dangerous luxury and death was always just one mistake away. When morning came, Dominic was a different man. Not fundamentally changed, but lighter in a way, as if he had finally allowed himself to feel the weight of his choices instead of simply pushing them down. And Stella was there, constant and solid, reminding him that he didn't have to carry everything alone anymore. The weeks after Marco's death were a period of consolidation. Dominic had to reaffirm his control, deal with men Marco had tried to turn, negotiate with the Bertelli from a position of strength now that the internal traitor was eliminated. It was exhausting, brutal, but necessary. And through it all, Stella was there. She began to take a more active role in the organization, not in operations but in administration, in management of legitimate businesses that masked less legal activities. She discovered she had a talent for numbers, for organization, for seeing connections others missed. Dominic began to trust her with sensitive information, including her in important decisions, valuing her perspectives. Others in the organization eventually accepted her presence. Some because Dominic made it clear she had his complete protection. Others because they saw her competence, her loyalty, her real usefulness. She would never be fully accepted, never be one of them in the traditional sense, but she carved out a space for herself where she belonged beside Dominic. The war with the Bertelli eventually ended not with a dramatic explosion, but with cautious agreements and redistribution of territories. Both sides were bleeding too much, losing too much, and more pragmatic leaders prevailed. Dominic emerged, strengthened from the situation, his position more secure because he had shown strength but also strategic restraint when it mattered. And through it all, at the center of everything, was the growing love between Dominic and Stella. It wasn't fairy tale love. It was love forged in fire, tested by betrayal and violence, stained by the realities of a world that didn't forgive weakness. But it was real in a way few loves were, because it was based not on illusions, but on complete acceptance, on seeing all the truth of each other and choosing to love anyway. 6 months after the night Stella was torn from Vincent's house, 6 months of transformation and discovery, Dominic did something unexpected. He took her back to her old neighborhood, to the street where she grew up, to the house she had left. The house was empty now. Vincent had disappeared weeks after selling Stella, possibly fleeing other debts, possibly dead in some alley no one knew or cared enough to find out. Dominic parked in front and they simply sat in the car for a moment, looking at the deteriorated house. Then he said he had bought it, that it was hers now to do whatever she wanted with. She could sell it, could demolish it, could transform it into something new. But she would have a choice. Now she had control over the place that once imprisoned her. Stella looked at the house, at the window of the room where she had spent so many nights dreaming of a different life, and felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, just neutral emptiness. That place no longer had power over her. She was no longer the frightened girl hiding behind books and impossible dreams. She was a woman who survived, who adapted, who found strength where she didn't know it existed. She told Dominic to sell it, that she didn't need the place, didn't want any physical connection to the past that had hurt her, that her future was in his apartment, beside him, building something new together. Dominic nodded, and she saw pride in his eyes, pride in how she had transformed, in how she refused to be defined by where she came from. When they returned to the apartment, Stella saw it with new eyes. It was no longer a prison or foreign territory. It was home. It was a place where she was valued, where she had a voice, where she belonged. The white walls no longer seemed cold, now illuminated by shared presence. The marble was no longer intimidating, just beautiful in a practical way. They established a strange but functional life. Mornings were often quiet, both waking up together now, sharing coffee and newspaper in comfortable intimacy. Days were work, sometimes separate, sometimes together, navigating the complexities of managing an empire built on grey territory. Nights were theirs, time reserved just to be together, to talk about everything and nothing, to simply exist in each other's space. Dominic began to smile more frequently, real laughter escaping when she said something particularly clever or absurd. Stella began to dress in more color, allowing herself to wear clothes Dominic insisted on buying, beginning to see beauty in a reflection she once only saw as something to avoid. Not because she had lost weight. Her body remained large and soft, but because she began to see through his eyes, eyes that saw her as beautiful, not despite her body, but simply as part of the total package that was her. One night, almost 8 months since she had arrived, Stella was preparing for bed when Dominic called her to the terrace. She went, curious, and found him standing by the railing, looking at the city spread below. It was a clear night, rare in Newark, stars visible despite the light pollution. He said nothing when she approached, simply extended his arm, inviting her to his side. She fit against him, and they stayed like that for a moment, just appreciating the silence and unexpected beauty of the night. Then Dominic began to speak, his voice low and sincere. He said he never imagined feeling what he felt for her, that his life before her was functional but empty, success without purpose, power without meaning, that she had given him a reason to wake up beyond simply maintaining control and surviving, that she made him want to be better, do better, build something beyond an empire of fear. Then he did something completely unexpected. He knelt there on the terrace under the stars and took a small box from his pocket. He opened it, revealing a simple but elegant ring, a platinum band with a solitary diamond that shone even in the weak light. And he asked. He asked her to marry him, not because he had to ask, not out of obligation or convenience, but because he wanted to spend the rest of his life knowing she was his in the most official way possible, that they were partners in every sense. Stella stood completely still, barely able to process what was happening. Marriage was something she had never considered possible for herself, a fantasy so distant she had never dared entertain it. And now, here was this man, this impossible man who controlled a criminal empire, but who treated her as if she were the most precious thing in his world, asking her to stay permanently. Tears began to fall before she could respond, and Dominic immediately became alarmed, thinking he had made a mistake. But she was shaking her head, laughing through the tears, saying yes before she even fully processed the decision, because there was no doubt. Despite everything, despite the impossible circumstances of how they met, despite the violence and danger that surrounded his life, she couldn't imagine a future where she wasn't by his side. Dominic slid the ring on her finger, with hands that trembled slightly, betraying the depth of his emotion. Then he stood up and pulled her into an embrace that squeezed all the air from her lungs, and she could feel his body trembling slightly, could hear his uneven breathing, could feel his tears wetting her hair. They stayed like that for an eternity, two lonely people who found in each other unexpected salvation. The wedding, when it happened, was private, just necessary witnesses and a lawyer to make it legal. Stella wore a simple but beautiful dress that Dominic had insisted on having custom made, and for the first time in her life, she felt beautiful. Not because the dress hid her body, but because the dress was made for her body, embracing her curves instead of trying to minimize them. And mainly because Dominic looked at her as if she were the only person in the world, as if she were absolutely perfect, exactly as she was. When they exchanged vows, the words were simple, but loaded with the weight of everything they had shared, everything they had survived. When Dominic slid the wedding band on her finger beside the engagement ring, his hands were steady, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that took her breath away. And when he kissed her to seal the union, it was their first real kiss, the first moment where they touched with clear romantic intention, and it was so perfect, it made years of pain worth it. Life after marriage continued with the same strange but functional dynamic, just with the addition of legality that made everything seem more permanent, more real. Stella Romano Caruso now, name on documents, Mrs. Caruso, at the rare public events they attended. She took on more responsibilities, managing aspects of business that were important, but that Dominic didn't have patience to monitor closely. She discovered she had a talent for it, for finding efficiencies, for dealing with people in ways that complemented Dominic's more direct style. They weren't a perfect couple. They had arguments, moments of frustration when Dominic's work demanded more than he could give, when dangers arose and tested their nerves. But they always came back to each other, always remembered what they had survived together, always chose to keep choosing each other. And slowly, very slowly, Stella began to heal, not in obvious ways, but in deeper forms. She began to laugh more frequently, a sound that had been so rare in her life becoming more common. She began to allow herself space, both literal and figurative, stopping trying to hide or minimize her presence. She even began to look in mirrors without instinctive recoil of shame, beginning to see her reflection not as an enemy, but simply as a neutral reality that had no inherent power over her worth. Dominic saw all these changes, and they meant everything to him. Seeing Stella flourishing, seeing her gaining confidence and comfort in her own skin, seeing her realizing she was desired and valued not despite anything but simply for being herself, satisfied something in him he didn't know he needed. It made the violence and darkness of his life seem to have purpose, if the result was being able to give this woman the life she deserved, but never received. 1 year after the wedding, almost 2 years after that rainy night when Vincent sold her, Stella stood on the terrace of the apartment, now true home, looking at the city that had once intimidated her. Dominic found her there, wrapping his arms around her from behind, pulling her against his chest, his chin resting on top of her head. They stayed like that in comfortable silence until Stella spoke, her voice soft but clear. She said she was grateful. Not for how it started, never for that, but for the journey that brought her here, that she never imagined being loved the way he loved her, being seen the way he saw her, having a life with meaning and purpose and real partnership. That if she had to go through everything again, each humiliation and fear and moment of pain, to end up here with him, she would do it without hesitation. Dominic tightened his embrace, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, and she felt moisture where his tears fell in her hair. He said she had saved him as much as he had saved her, that she had given him reason to be more than just a survivor, more than just a man of power. That she was the anchor that kept him human in a world that constantly pushed him in the opposite direction. When the sun began to rise, painting the city in tones of gold and pink, they remained together, two unlikely survivors who found in each other not dramatic salvation, but something perhaps more valuable, real partnership, love that recognized flaws and chose to stay anyway. A promise of a future built not on fantasies, but on commitment to keep showing up for each other, day after day, choice after choice. The story didn't end there, because stories rarely end so cleanly. There were more challenges, more moments when Dominic's violent world threatened to engulf them, more times when Stella had to be stronger than she thought possible, but they faced everything together, side by side, remembering they had survived the impossible and would continue surviving. Dominic began to make changes in how he managed his businesses. Not dramatic abandonment of everything he had built, but gradual transition, moving resources to more legitimate operations, distancing himself from the most violent aspects whenever possible. It wasn't complete redemption. He still lived in the shadows, still made decisions that stained his hands, but there was direction now, movement toward something less destructive. Stella saw these changes and understood they were for her, or at least partially. Dominic wanted to build something that could last, something that wouldn't eventually consume them. He was trying to find an impossible balance between the world he knew and the future he wanted with her. It was during this transition period that Stella discovered something unexpected. She had been feeling strange for weeks, tired in a different way, her body changing in subtle ways. When she finally went to the doctor, alone because she didn't want to worry Dominic unnecessarily, she received news that changed everything again. She was pregnant, almost 3 months. The news hit her like an avalanche of contradictory emotions. Fear, because how to bring a child into their world, a world of danger and violence. Joy, because she had always wanted a real family, people who would love her unconditionally as she had never been loved. Uncertainty, because she had no model of healthy motherhood, only memories of a mother who died too early and a father who hated her. She returned to the apartment in a state of silent shock, processing. Dominic was in his office, but he immediately noticed something was different. He came out, found her standing in the middle of the room, staring at nothing, and immediately became alert. He asked what was wrong, if someone had hurt her, if there was a threat. Stella looked at him, at this man who had transformed her life in so many impossible ways, and simply said it. She said she was pregnant, words coming out in a quick stream, because if she stopped, she couldn't start again. Then she waited, heart hammering, not knowing how he would react. Dominic stood completely still, his face going through a series of expressions so fast she could barely track them. Shock, fear, confusion, and then something that made tears spring to his eyes. Pure joy, not tempered by any other emotion. He crossed the room in 2 steps and fell to his knees in front of her, his hands going to her belly with a reverence that took her breath away. He pressed his forehead against her through the clothing, his breathing uneven, and when he spoke his voice was broken. He said she had given him everything, more than he deserved, more than he had dreamed possible. That the idea of raising a child with her, of building a real family based on love instead of obligation or survival, was something so beautiful he could barely believe it was real. Stella passed her fingers through his hair, her own tears falling, and for the first time since discovering it, she felt hope without fear tempering it. If Dominic was happy, if he wanted this as much as she secretly wanted it, then maybe they could make it work. Maybe they could give this child what they both never had. The following months were a period of intense adjustment. Dominic became almost obsessively protective, increasing security, limiting Stella's exposure to anything potentially dangerous, insisting on the best doctors and care. Stella had to remind him occasionally that pregnancy wasn't a disease, that she wouldn't break, but she also understood. This was too important, meant too much, and the fear of losing it was genuine and overwhelming. As the pregnancy progressed, Stella flourished in unexpected ways. A body that had always been a source of shame now had purpose, was creating life, and this fundamentally changed how she saw herself. When her belly grew, she allowed herself to touch it with pride instead of hiding. Dominic was fascinated by each change, his hands constantly seeking to feel the baby's movement, his voice softening when he spoke to her belly in Italian, the language of his childhood that he rarely used. They transformed one of the guest rooms into a nursery, and it was during this process that Stella saw a side of Dominic she had never imagined. He painted the walls personally, choosing soft tones of yellow and green, because they didn't know the sex and wanted a surprise. He assembled furniture with patience she didn't know he possessed, reading instructions carefully, ensuring everything was perfectly safe. He chose children's books with a seriousness that would make anyone smile, debating the merits of different stories as if they were critical business decisions. Seeing this man who inspired fear in so many, who had taken lives when necessary, who had built an empire on a foundation of calculated violence, preparing with such tender care for a child, made Stella's love for him grow in ways she didn't think possible. He would be a good father, she knew that now. Not perfect, because neither of them was, but present, dedicated, loving in the ways that mattered. The child was born on a spring morning, after long labor that tested Stella's limits in ways she hadn't anticipated. Dominic was with her through everything, holding her hand, whispering encouragement, looking more scared than she had ever seen him. When finally their son, because it was a boy, emerged with a healthy cry that filled the room, Dominic cried openly. They named him Antonio, for Dominic's grandfather, whom he had never met, but about whom his mother had told stories. Antonio Michael Caruso, small and perfect, with tiny fingers that curled around Dominic's finger and made this hard man melt completely. The first weeks were exhaustion and joy mixed. Stella discovered that motherhood was simultaneously more difficult and more rewarding than anything she had ever experienced. Dominic was present in ways many men in his position wouldn't be, waking up for nighttime feedings when she pumped milk, changing diapers without complaining, simply holding Antonio for hours while the baby slept against his chest. Seeing Dominic with their son transformed something fundamental in Stella. He was so gentle, so careful, treating Antonio as the most precious thing that had ever existed. He whispered promises to the sleeping baby, oaths that this child would never know abandonment or rejection or lack of love that both his parents had experienced, that he would grow up knowing he was wanted, that his existence was a blessing, not a burden. Antonio grew up in an environment of intense love, tempered by the reality of who his parents were and the world they inhabited. Dominic made more aggressive decisions about transitioning to legitimate businesses, motivated now not just by wanting a better future with Stella, but by giving his son a chance at life without constantly looking over his shoulder. It wasn't quick, required years of careful planning, but there was real movement. Stella became the mother she had always wanted to have, patient when Antonio was difficult, loving even when exhausted, present in the ways that mattered. She read to him every night, the same stories that had once saved her, passing on the love for words and imagined worlds. She held him when he cried, celebrated every milestone, saw in him not an extension of herself, but a unique person, deserving of unconditional love. When Antonio was 2 years old, a little tornado of energy and endless curiosity, Stella was on the terrace with him on a summer afternoon. He was chasing bubbles she blew, laughing, with the total abandon that only children can achieve. Dominic was inside, on a business call, but she could see him through the glass windows, and occasionally he looked up and smiled at the scene in front of him. Stella thought about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the girl she had been, invisible and unloved. existing on the margins of a life that rejected her. She thought about the night when Vincent sold her, about the terror and despair of that moment. She thought about meeting Dominic, about the slow revelation that he was more complex than appearance suggested, about how love had grown between them on unlikely soil. She thought about all the times they almost didn't survive, about betrayals and violence and moments when the future seemed impossible. But she also thought about resilience, about how they both refused to give up, about how they found in each other strength to continue when it would have been easier to surrender. Antonio ran to her, throwing himself in her lap with the total confidence of a child who had never known rejection. She held him tight, inhaling his smell, his soft hair against her cheek, and felt gratitude so deep it almost hurt. This life, this unlikely family, this love that had survived everything that tried to destroy it, was more than she had ever dared dream. Dominic eventually finished his call and came out to join them. He sat beside Stella, pulling her and Antonio into his embrace, creating a small circle of warmth and security against the soft summer breeze. They stayed like that while the sun slowly descended, painting the city in golden tones, three people who found in each other salvation they didn't know they needed. It wasn't a perfect fairy tale ending. There were still challenges, still moments of fear and uncertainty. Dominic's world, even with the transitions he had made, still had dangerous elements. Stella still occasionally struggled with deeply rooted insecurities. Antonio would grow up asking questions about their family that would be difficult to answer honestly. But they had love, real love, tested by fire, forged in impossible circumstances, but genuine in a way few loves were. They had commitment to keep showing up for each other, to face challenges together, to build something better for their son than either of them had. As the years passed, the small family found a rhythm that worked. Dominic eventually managed to pass control of the more problematic operations to others, maintaining only oversight of businesses that were legitimate or close enough to sleep at night. He would never be completely clean. The past didn't disappear, but he built a present he could defend and a future he could offer his son. Stella continued flourishing, her confidence growing with each year. She returned to studying, taking online courses, discovering a passion for psychology and social work. She eventually began volunteer work, helping women in situations similar to the one she had escaped, offering hope and practical resources to those trapped in cycles of abuse. It was work that gave purpose beyond family, that used her painful experiences in ways that helped others. Antonio grew up loved in ways that fundamentally shaped him. He was a confident but kind child, knowing he was wanted, that his opinions mattered, that his mistakes wouldn't change his parents' love. He had Stella's curiosity and Dominic's determination, a combination that promised an interesting person when he grew up. The family eventually expanded. Another child, a girl this time, whom they named Maria for Dominic's mother. Then years later, a final surprise, twins who kept everyone busy but filled the apartment with the noisy chaos of love and life. The apartment that had once been a cold prison transformed into a real home. Walls that were immaculate white now had children's art hung proudly. Designer furniture gained stains and scratches from real use. Silence was replaced by the sounds of a family living. Dominic aged in ways that made him more distinguished than diminished. Grey hair at the temples, deeper lines around his eyes, but also a more frequent smile, easier laughter, less rigid posture. He learned to delegate, to trust, to let the impossible standards he had imposed on himself slip occasionally. He learned that being a good father and husband was more important than being a perfect boss. Stella also aged, but differently than she would have aged without Dominic. Her body changed with pregnancies and years, but she carried those changes with dignity that came from knowing she was loved, regardless of appearance. Her hair gained silver strands that she didn't hide. Her face gained lines that came from laughing and living. She moved through the world with a presence she never had when young, occupying space without apology, living instead of just existing. They never forgot where they began. Occasionally, late at night after the children slept, they talked about that first night, about how impossible it seemed they would get here, about the choices they made, the risks they took, the moments when they almost lost everything. Those conversations were important, keeping them anchored in gratitude, reminding them to never take for granted what they had built. Vincent never reappeared in Stella's life. She heard eventually that he had died a few years after selling her, alone and unmourned, another casualty of a life lived without love or real connection. She felt nothing. Not satisfaction in his downfall, not sadness for a relationship that never was, just neutral emptiness where a person should be. He no longer had power over her, not even as a memory. Dominic maintained connections with some people from his old life, those who remained loyal, who made the transition with him. But many disappeared with time, following different paths or finding less happy endings. He carried those losses, but didn't let them define him. The past informed him, but didn't control him. On one particular night, almost 20 years after that first night, when Stella had arrived soaked and terrified at his apartment, they were again on the terrace. The children were young adults now, scattered in various directions following their own paths. The apartment was quiet, in a way it hadn't been in years, reminding them of when it was just the two of them. Stella was nestled against Dominic in the way that had become second nature over the years, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her. They looked at the city that had witnessed their journey, that held memories of everything they had survived and built. Dominic broke the silence with a simple observation. He said he didn't regret anything, not even the dark parts of his past, because they all led to this moment, to this life. That if he could go back, he would change details, but not results, because the results gave him her, gave him family, gave him reason to transform himself. Stella considered this, then responded with honesty that came from decades of knowing each other completely. She said she also wouldn't change anything fundamental, that her pain shaped who she became, that her experiences made her capable of appreciating what she had in ways someone who never suffered never could, that she would choose to suffer everything again if it guaranteed getting here, with him, with the life they built. They remained like that while the city below pulsed with its millions of stories, each one complex and unique. They were just one story among many, no more important or significant than any other, but it was their story, and they lived it completely, with brutal honesty about their flaws, but also with fierce commitment to keep trying. When they finally went back inside, there were no grand declarations or dramatic resolutions, just comfortable continuity of shared life, of two people who chose each other daily over decades, through every challenge and joy. And as they prepared for sleep, a routine so established it was practically ritual, Stella looked at Dominic, this man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had loved her when she was unlovable, who had built with her something stronger than the circumstances that should have destroyed it, and she felt gratitude so deep that words couldn't capture it. Dominic took her hand as they lay down, a small but significant gesture, maintaining connection even in sleep. And in the darkness of their room, in the heart of a life that defied all odds, they found peace that came not from perfection, but from acceptance, not from ease, but from commitment, not from fantasy, but from real love with all its complexities and contradictions. The story of Stella and Dominic wasn't about rescue or simple redemption. It was about two damaged people who found in each other the possibility of healing, about love that grew in impossible soil because both were willing to care for it through all the difficult seasons. It was about the choice to keep trying even when it would be easier to give up, about building family when neither of them had a model of how to do it right, about transforming trauma into strength without denying the pain it caused. It was an imperfect story about imperfect people creating imperfect but real love, and in the end, perhaps that was more beautiful than any fairy tale could be, because it was honest, it was earned, it was theirs. What lesson did you learn from this story? How can love flourish, even in the most unlikely circumstances, and transform people who think they're too broken to be fixed? It's important for us to know what these stories mean to you. If this story touched your heart, leave a like on this video and click the subscribe button to follow the next videos on the channel. See you in our next story.